Karen Whitmore stood in her pristine kitchen, watching through Venetian blinds as her newest neighbors moved boxes into the house at 1247 Maple Drive. The sight of the military-issued duffel bags and the man's crew cut told her everything she needed to know. Another veteran. She'd dealt with their type before. They always thought the rules didn't apply to them. "Honey, what's got you so worked up?" her husband Dale called from his recliner, not bothering to look up from his sports highlights. "Nothing that concerns you?" Karen snapped, already reaching for her HOA enforcement clipboard. As head of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Compliance Committee, she'd made it her personal mission to maintain the neighborhood's property values, and that meant ensuring every resident followed the rules to the letter. Within minutes, she was marching across the street, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement like gunshots. The moving truck was still there, a clear violation of Section 4.2 of the Community Guidelines, which stated that all moving vehicles must be removed from residential streets within 8 hours of arrival. "Excuse me?" Karen announced loudly, approaching the couple struggling with a heavy box. The woman was petite with kind eyes, while her husband was built like a linebacker despite his graying temples. "I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA Compliance Officer. You're in violation of our community moving truck policy." The woman, Sarah, set down her end of the box and smiled warmly. "Oh, hello, I'm so sorry. We weren't aware. We just started unloading an hour ago. The movers said they'd be done by 5. The policy clearly states 8 hours maximum," Karen replied curtly, though she could see the timestamp on the truck's permit showed they'd only been there since noon. "I need to see your moving permit and your landscaping approval forms." The husband, Marcus, stepped forward with a measured calm that Karen immediately recognized as trouble. Veterans always had that look, like they were sizing up a threat. "Ma'am, we submitted all required paperwork 3 weeks ago. Your office approved everything. I'll be the judge of that." Karen flipped through her clipboard with practiced authority. "And while we're discussing violations, I notice your grass height appears to be exceeding the 2-inch maximum." Sarah blinked in confusion. "But we just moved in today. This is our first time seeing the lawn." "Ignorance isn't an excuse," Karen declared, already scribbling notes. "You have 48 hours to bring everything into compliance, or you'll face fines starting at $200 per violation." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let me get this straight. You're fining us for grass we've never even owned and a truck that's been here for less than 2 hours. Rules are rules, Mr. Rodriguez." Master Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez retired. Karen's smile turned razor sharp. She'd been hoping he'd pull the military card. They always did. "Well, Master Sergeant, this isn't the Army. In Willowbrook Estates, I'm the commanding officer." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Sarah touched her husband's arm gently, but Karen could see the storm clouds gathering in his dark eyes. She'd won this round, established dominance early. But as she turned to leave, clipboard clutched triumphantly to her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a very dangerous enemy. Behind her, she heard Sarah whisper, "Marcus, let it go. It's just money." But Karen knew better. It was never just about money. It was about power, control, and respect. And she intended to get all 3 from her new neighbors, no matter what it took. 3 days later, Karen received the call she'd been expecting. Marcus Rodriguez was requesting a hearing to contest his violations. She'd scheduled it for Thursday evening at the community center, deliberately choosing a time when most residents would be having dinner with their families. The fewer witnesses, the better. Karen arrived early, arranging her files and documentation across the conference table. Like armor, she'd spent hours researching every possible violation she could pin on the Rodriguez family. From the faded welcome mat on their porch to the newspaper delivery that briefly blocked their driveway each morning. Marcus and Sarah entered at exactly 7 o'clock, and Karen noted with satisfaction that they looked tired. Good. The stress was getting to them. "Thank you for coming," Karen began, her voice dripping with false courtesy. "I've reviewed your case, and I'm afraid the violations stand. However, I'm willing to discuss a payment plan." "We're not here to discuss payment," Marcus said firmly, sliding a manila folder across the table. We're here to discuss your harassment. Karen's practiced smile faltered for just a moment. Harassment? I hardly think. 6 visits in 3 days, Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger than Karen had expected. Demanding entry to inspect our backyard fence, measuring our mailbox height with a ruler, following our landscaper around with a notepad. I was performing my duties as... You were trespassing, Marcus cut her off. And yesterday when you cornered my wife at the grocery store to lecture her about our porch light being too bright, that crossed a line. Karen felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been particularly proud of that encounter, catching Sarah off guard in the cereal aisle, where she couldn't escape. I was simply providing educational outreach about community standards. You followed me to 3 different aisles and blocked my cart when I tried to leave, Sarah said quietly. My daughter was with me. She was scared. Something cold settled in Karen's stomach at the mention of a child, but she pushed it aside. Rules were rules and feelings didn't enter into the equation. Perhaps if you'd been more receptive to community feedback initially, none of this would be necessary. Marcus leaned forward, and Karen suddenly understood why enemy combatants had probably been afraid of this man. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen very carefully. You will stop harassing my family. You will process our paperwork properly and fairly, and you will conduct yourself professionally, or I will file complaints with the city, the state, and anyone else who will listen. Are you threatening me? Karen's voice pitched higher than she intended. I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions, Marcus replied evenly. Just like you've been informing us. The room fell silent except for the humming of fluorescent lights overhead. Karen could feel control slipping away from her like sand through her fingers. She'd handled dozens of these hearings, and they always ended with the homeowner capitulating. They always backed down when faced with official authority and documentation. But Marcus Rodriguez wasn't backing down. He was sitting perfectly still, hands folded, watching her with the patience of a man who'd learned to wait for his moment. Very well, Karen said finally, gathering her papers with sharp, aggressive movements. Since you want to play hardball, Mr. Rodriguez, let's play hardball. I'll be conducting a full property inspection tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And I do mean full. Every inch of your property, every blade of grass, every fixture and fitting. You'll need a warrant for that, Sarah said softly. Karen's laugh was brittle as breaking glass. Honey, I don't need a warrant. I have something better. I have the HOA covenant that you signed when you bought your house. Section 12, subsection 4. Look it up. As she swept out of the community center, Karen felt the familiar rush of victory. She'd shown them who was in charge, but as she reached her car, she realized her hands were shaking, not from triumph but from something else entirely. Fear. Karen arrived at 1247 Maple Drive at exactly 7:55 a.m., flanked by 2 men in cheap suits. She'd hired them from a private security company that specialized in property enforcement, a fancy way of saying they looked intimidating and followed orders without asking questions. The bigger one, who went by Tank, cracked his knuckles as they approached the front door. His partner, a wiry man named Vince, carried a clipboard that mirrored Karen's own. She'd briefed them thoroughly the night before. This was about establishing dominance, showing the Rodriguez family that their little rebellion had consequences. Sarah answered the door in a bathrobe, clearly having been woken up despite the scheduled time. Behind her, Karen could hear the sounds of a child getting ready for school. Cereal bowls clinking, backpack zippers, morning cartoon music. Mrs. Rodriguez, Karen announced, we're here for the property inspection. I'm sorry, but this isn't a good time, Sarah said, trying to close the door slightly. My daughter has school and my husband is... The time was set yesterday evening, Tank interrupted, stepping forward to block the door from closing. Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Karen felt a thrill of power watching Sarah's face go pale. This was what happened when people challenged her authority. They learned that she had resources they didn't, connections they couldn't match. Where's your husband? Karen asked, pushing past Sarah into the foyer. The house smelled like coffee and pancakes, wholesome and domestic. It disgusted her. He's upstairs getting dressed, Sarah replied, following helplessly as Karen began examining the crown molding with exaggerated attention. "Vince, check the baseboards for proper height requirements," Karen instructed loudly. "Tank, I want measurements on all window treatments." "Mommy, who are these people?" A small voice from the kitchen made Karen turn. A girl of maybe 8 stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, holding a piece of toast. "Go finish getting ready for school, sweetheart," Sarah said quickly, but her voice was strained. Karen smiled at the child, a cold, calculating expression that made the little girl step backward. "Hello there. I'm Mrs. Whitmore. I make sure everyone follows the rules in your neighborhood." "Karen." Marcus's voice came from the stairway, and when Karen looked up, she saw him descending with the controlled movements of a man barely containing his rage. He was fully dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, but somehow he looked more dangerous than he had in the conference room. "Mr. Rodriguez, I hope you're prepared to cooperate with our inspection." "I'm prepared to ask you to leave my house immediately." "I'm afraid that's not an option," Karen replied, consulting her clipboard. "We have several areas of concern to address. Tank, why don't we start with the master bedroom? I want to check those window measurements." The security guard started toward the stairs, but Marcus moved to block his path. The two men faced each other in the narrow hallway, and Karen could practically see the testosterone crackling between them. "Nobody goes upstairs," Marcus said quietly. "Sir, we have the right to inspect all areas of the property," Tank replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "You have the right to inspect the exterior and common areas. My family's private spaces are off limits." Karen stepped forward, sensing the moment she'd been building toward. "Mr. Rodriguez, if you continue to obstruct this inspection, I'll have no choice but to call the police and report you for violating your HOA agreement." "Go ahead and call them," Marcus said, pulling out his own phone. "While you're at it, I'll call them too. I'm sure they'd be interested to know about 2 unlicensed security guards attempting to force their way into a private residence." For the first time since entering the house, Karen felt uncertainty creep in. Tank was looking at her questioningly, clearly not having expected this level of resistance. Vince had stopped pretending to measure baseboards and was watching the confrontation with obvious nervousness. "This is ridiculous," Karen declared, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "We're simply trying to maintain community standards. By intimidating my wife and terrorizing my daughter." Marcus's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made him seem more dangerous. "By bringing muscle into my home?" Sarah had moved to stand beside her husband, and Karen could see the little girl peeking around the kitchen doorway. 3 pairs of eyes stared at her with a mixture of fear, anger, and disgust that made her feel suddenly small and exposed. But Karen Whitmore had not gotten to where she was by backing down from fights. She'd built her reputation on being tougher, more ruthless, more persistent than anyone else in Willowbrook Estates. It was time to show the Rodriguez family exactly what they were dealing with. "Tank, Vince, start documenting everything," Karen ordered, her voice rising to match her escalating frustration. "Photograph all potential violations. I want this family to understand the full scope of their non-compliance." The 2 security guards exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic setting. Tank pulled out a camera, but his movements were hesitant. "Ma'am," Vince said quietly, "maybe we should—" "You'll do what you're paid to do," Karen snapped, then turned back to Marcus. "Your resistance is only making this worse for your family, Mr. Rodriguez. Every minute you delay this inspection adds another violation to your file. Get out of my house." Marcus's words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Karen laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the warm kitchen. "Or what? You'll what, soldier boy? Hit me? Go ahead, I dare you. Tank here has a camera running. One touch and you'll be arrested for assault." The room went deadly quiet. Even the morning cartoon sounds from the TV seemed to fade away. Sarah's hand found her husband's arm, but Karen could see the muscle in his jaw jumping like a live wire. "I don't hit women," Marcus said finally, "but that doesn't mean I'll let you terrorize my family." "Terrorize?" Karen's voice climbed another octave. "I'm enforcing community standards. This is about property values, about maintaining the neighborhood that decent people have invested their life savings in. This is about you getting off on pushing people around, Sarah said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. You're nothing but a bully with a clipboard. Karen whirled on the smaller woman, her face flushing red. Excuse me? I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I've served on the HOA board for 8. I've dedicated my life to maintaining the standards that keep this community desirable. And I won't be lectured by some military wife who's been here less than a week. Military wife? Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet now. I'm a registered nurse who's worked in trauma units for 12 years. I've saved more lives than you've written violations. Don't you dare reduce me to my husband's career. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She'd made a tactical error, attacking Sarah's identity instead of sticking to rule violations. But she was too far committed to back down now. I don't care what you do for work, Karen snarled. In this neighborhood, you follow my rules or you face the consequences. Your rules? Marcus stepped forward again, and this time Karen instinctively backed up. Lady, you're not the queen of suburbia. You're just a sad, lonely woman who gets her kicks from making other people miserable. The accuracy of his words was like a knife between her ribs. Karen felt tears of rage and humiliation burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of these people. Not in front of Tank and Vince, who were already looking at her with obvious discomfort. That's it, she declared, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police and reporting you for threatening behavior. Tank, I want you to document Mr. Rodriguez's aggressive posture and hostile demeanor. Ma'am, Tank said hesitantly, I don't think. Do your job. Karen screamed, all pretense of professionalism abandoning her. The little girl in the kitchen doorway began to cry. The sound of the child's tears seemed to break something in the room. Sarah immediately moved to comfort her daughter, gathering the small girl into her arms and whispering soothing words. Marcus stepped protectively in front of both of them, his body language shifting from angry to purely defensive. And Karen stood in the middle of it all, holding her phone, watching a family unite against her. The security guards were looking at her like she was a monster. The morning sun streaming through the kitchen window seemed to highlight every harsh line on her face. For the first time in years, Karen Whitmore saw herself clearly. And she didn't like what she saw. But it was too late to stop now. She'd gone too far, pushed too hard, made too many enemies. The only way forward was through, even if it meant burning down everything in her path. She dialed 911 with shaking fingers, not knowing that this single call would change everything for everyone in that warm, morning kitchen. The police arrived in 2 patrol cars, their red and blue lights painting the morning suburbia in alternating colors of emergency. Karen stood on the Rodriguez's front porch, having positioned herself as the victim before the officers even reached the door. Officers, thank God you're here, she began, clutching her clipboard like a shield. I'm Karen Whitmore, head of the HOA Compliance Committee. This man has been threatening me and obstructing a lawful property inspection. Officer Williams, a veteran cop with kind eyes and graying temples, looked between Karen and the family visible through the screen door. Behind the glass, he could see Marcus holding his crying daughter while Sarah rubbed the child's back soothingly. Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what happened? Williams asked, pulling out his notepad. Karen launched into her prepared statement, describing Marcus as aggressive and uncooperative, painting herself as a public servant simply trying to do her job. She pointed to Tank and Vince as witnesses, though both men were looking increasingly uncomfortable with their role in the situation. And he threatened to physically assault me, Karen concluded, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I feared for my safety. Officer Williams knocked on the screen door. Marcus approached, still holding his daughter, and Karen felt a moment of satisfaction. He looked like the aggressor now, a large, intimidating man facing down a police officer, while holding a child. Sir, I'm Officer Williams. Can you tell me your side of what happened here? They forced their way into my home at 8 in the morning, Marcus said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. My daughter was getting ready for school. This woman brought 2 security guards and demanded to inspect our private bedrooms. You signed an HOA agreement. Karen interjected. Section 12, subsection 4 clearly states, "Ma'am, let him finish," Williams said firmly. Karen's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes burned with indignation. "She's been harassing my family for a week," Marcus continued. "Following my wife to the grocery store, trespassing on our property, writing citations for violations that don't exist. Today she crossed the line by bringing hired muscle to intimidate us." Williams looked at Tank and Vince, both of whom suddenly found the ground very interesting. "Are you gentlemen licensed security contractors?" "We're from Precision Protection Services," Tank mumbled. "Ma'am hired us to assist with property enforcement. Do you have permits to operate in this municipality?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Vince finally shook his head. Officer Williams turned back to Karen, and she could see the shift in his demeanor. "Ma'am, HOA inspections don't typically require security personnel, and unlicensed. Contractors can't legally operate enforcement actions in this city. That's a technicality," Karen snapped, feeling control slipping away again. "The important thing is that this man threatened me. I want him arrested for intimidation and assault." "Did Mr. Rodriguez touch you or threaten to touch you?" Karen hesitated. He used threatening body language. He stepped toward me in an aggressive manner. But no physical contact or verbal threats of violence? Not in so many words, but, "Ma'am, I need you to step back, please." Williams's tone had shifted from professional courtesy to something much cooler. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm going to need to ask you some questions, but first, can your wife take your daughter inside? This isn't something a child needs to witness." As Sarah led their daughter away from the door, Karen felt the situation spinning completely out of her control. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The police were supposed to see her as the authority figure, the victim, the one deserving protection. "Officer, I demand you arrest this man," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "I'm a pillar of this community. I've served on the city planning committee, the neighborhood watch program, Ma'am, I need you to calm down," Williams interrupted. "Your community service is noted, but it doesn't give you the right to bring unlicensed security into someone's home. They're trespassing on HOA property." "No, ma'am. They're in their own home, which they own, dealing with what appears to be harassment from their homeowners association." The words hit Karen like ice water. Harassment. That's what Williams saw. When he looked at her, not a dedicated community servant, but a harasser. A bully. A problem to be solved. "I want to file a complaint," she declared desperately. "This man is violating community standards, and if you won't enforce them, I'll find someone who will." Officer Williams closed his notepad with a sharp snap. "Ma'am, you're free to file whatever complaints you want through proper channels. But right now, I'm going to ask you and your associates to leave this family alone. Any further complaints about HOA violations can be handled through the appropriate legal channels." "This is outrageous. I know your supervisor. I know the mayor. Ma'am," Williams's voice carried a warning that made even Karen's self-righteous fury pause. "I strongly suggest you leave now before the situation escalates further." As Karen stalked away from the Rodriguez house, trailing Tank and Vince behind her, like deflated balloons, she could feel the eyes of neighbors watching from windows and doorways. Word would spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire. Karen Whitmore had been dressed down by the police, humiliated in front of the very people she was supposed to be controlling. But Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. If Marcus Rodriguez wanted to play hardball, she'd show him what real power looked like. She had connections, resources, and 15 years of dirt on every family in this neighborhood. It was time to escalate this war to a level the good Master Sergeant had never imagined. Karen spent the weekend in her home office, surrounded by filing cabinets and community records dating back over a decade. If the police wouldn't help her, and if direct confrontation had failed, then it was time to deploy the nuclear option. Systematic bureaucratic warfare. She started with the building permits. Every addition, every fence, every deck built in Willowbrook Estates over the past 15 years. Karen had copies of everything, and more importantly, she knew which permits had been obtained properly and which had been flexible in their interpretation. The Martinez family at 1251 Maple Drive had built their pool deck 2 inches closer to the property line than regulations allowed. The Johnsons on Oak Street had converted their garage without proper electrical permits. The Patels had installed a water feature that violated the noise ordinance during quiet hours. All of these violations had been overlooked during Karen's tenure because the families had been cooperative, pleasant, and willing to work within the system. But now they would serve as ammunition. By Monday morning, Karen had drafted 17 separate violation notices to homes on the Rodriguez's street. Each notice was meticulously documented, legally airtight, and carried fines ranging from $500 to $2,000. The message was clear. If you lived near the Rodriguez family, you would pay the price for their rebellion. But her masterpiece was the complaint she filed with the city's Veterans Affairs Office. Karen had done her research over the weekend, discovering that Marcus had received his military housing allowance to help purchase the home. She crafted a detailed letter alleging fraud, claiming that he had misrepresented the property's compliance status to obtain federal benefits. The allegations were completely fabricated, but Karen had learned long ago that the initial accusation was often more damaging than the eventual truth. The investigation alone would tie up Marcus's finances for months, possibly jeopardizing his mortgage. Her phone rang as she was sealing the envelope. Dale's voice came through the speaker, tired and strained. "Karen, I'm getting calls from the neighbors. What the hell is going on?" "I'm maintaining community standards," she replied curtly, not looking up from her work. "Betty Martinez is crying on the phone about losing her house. She says you're fining her $2,000 for a deck she built 12 years ago with your approval. Rules." "Our rules, Dale. If people can't follow them." "Karen, stop." Dale's voice carried an authority she hadn't heard in years. "I've been married to you for 23 years and I've watched you turn into someone I don't recognize. This has to stop. Don't lecture me about, I'm moving out." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen finally looked up from her papers, the phone suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. "What did you say?" "I said I'm moving out tonight. I can't watch you destroy our neighborhood and our marriage for some petty power trip." "Dale, you're being ridiculous. This is about maintaining property values. This is about our investment. This is about you being a bully, Karen. And I won't be part of it anymore." The line went dead. Karen stared at the phone for a long moment, then slowly placed it back in its cradle. Through her office window, she could see the Rodriguez house across the street, morning sunlight gleaming off its windows like watching eyes. She sealed the envelope containing her complaint to the Veterans Affairs Office and set it aside with the stack of violation notices. Dale would come around once he saw the results. Once the neighborhood was back under control, once property values were protected, once everyone remembered why they needed Karen Whitmore. But as she prepared to deliver her paperwork blitzkrieg, Karen didn't notice the figure watching her house from across the street. Marcus Rodriguez stood in his front yard, cell phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly with someone who clearly commanded his respect. "Yes, sir," she could hear him saying if she'd been listening. "I understand. I'll have the documentation ready for your review." The war was about to escalate beyond anything Karen had imagined, and for the first time in her career as Willowbrook Estate's unofficial enforcer, she was about to face an enemy who understood tactics, strategy, and the kind of patient, methodical campaign that could dismantle her entire operation. But Karen was too focused on her immediate victory to notice the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The community center had never seen a crowd like this. By 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, every seat was filled, with residents lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Karen sat at the head table, surrounded by her carefully organized files, watching with growing unease as more and more neighbors filed in. She'd called the emergency HOA meeting to address what she termed a coordinated attack on community standards, expecting to rally support for her campaign against the Rodriguez family. Instead, she found herself facing a room full of angry faces, many clutching the violation notices she'd so carefully crafted. Betty Martinez stood at the microphone, holding a notice that threatened to foreclose on her home. "Mrs. Whittemore, you approved this deck construction yourself 12 years ago. I have the paperwork with your signature. How can you now claim it's a violation?" "Regulations change," Karen replied, her voice carrying less authority than usual. "Previous approvals don't grandfather illegal structures." Previous approvals? Tom Johnson's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Karen, you signed off on my garage conversion. You even recommended the contractor. The crowd was getting restless, voices rising as neighbor after neighbor stood to share similar stories. Karen felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. This wasn't going according to plan. If I could have everyone's attention, she said, standing and tapping her gavel. We're here to discuss the Rodriguez situation and the need for... We're here to discuss your resignation. The voice came from the back of the room and Karen looked up to see a woman in a business suit making her way toward the front. She didn't recognize her, but something about the woman's bearing suggested official authority. I'm sorry, who are you? Karen demanded. Susan Chen, Deputy Attorney General for the state's Consumer Protection Division. The woman reached the front of the room and turned to address the crowd. I'm here because we've received multiple complaints about HOA abuse and selective enforcement in this community. Karen's mouth went dry. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Mrs. Whitmore. We've been investigating your activities for the past week, thanks to documentation provided by several residents and one very thorough military officer who knows how to build a case. All eyes turned to Marcus Rodriguez, who sat quietly in the third row with his wife and daughter. He'd been saying nothing all evening, just watching and listening with the patience of a professional soldier. Furthermore, Chen continued, we've discovered that you've been operating outside your legal authority as an HOA officer. The threats, the unlicensed security contractors, the selective enforcement of violations, all of it constitutes harassment under state law. That's ridiculous, Karen protested, but her voice was shaking now. I'm protecting property values, I'm maintaining community standards. You're abusing your position for personal vendettas, Chen replied calmly. And as of tonight, your authority as HOA compliance officer is suspended pending a full investigation. The room erupted in applause. Karen looked around wildly, seeing the faces of neighbors she'd controlled for years now celebrating her downfall. Betty Martinez was crying with relief. Tom Johnson was shaking Marcus Rodriguez's hand. Even quiet Mrs. Patterson from the corner house was smiling. This is illegal, Karen shouted over the noise. You can't just walk in here and... Actually, I can. Chen handed her a thick envelope. You're being served with a cease and desist order, Mrs. Whitmore. Any further HOA enforcement actions by you will result in criminal charges. Karen's hand shook as she opened the envelope, seeing her own signature on document after document. All the approvals she'd given over the years, all the violations she'd selectively ignored, all the evidence that she'd been running the HOA like her personal kingdom rather than a community service organization. There's one more thing, Chen said, her voice cutting through Karen's shock. Mr. Rodriguez has declined to press charges for harassment, but only if you publicly apologize to his family and resign from all HOA positions immediately. The room fell silent. Every eye was on Karen as she stood at the head table, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed authority. She could fight this, she knew. Hire lawyers, drag it through the courts, make everyone's life miserable for months. But as she looked at the faces around her, neighbors who had once feared, her who had once jumped to follow her every directive, she realized that her real power had already evaporated. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They were disgusted by her. Sarah Rodriguez stood up slowly, holding her daughter's hand. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly, I'm a trauma nurse. I've seen what happens when people can't let go of anger, when they hold on to grudges until it poisons everything around them. It's not too late to choose a different path. The kindness in Sarah's voice was somehow worse than any accusation. Karen looked at the little girl beside her, the same child she'd made cry just days before, and felt something crack inside her chest. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry. The words felt foreign in her mouth, but as she said them, something shifted in the room. The anger didn't disappear, but it softened somehow, replaced by something that might eventually become forgiveness. I resign, Karen said, louder now. From all HOA positions, effective immediately. As she walked out of the community center, past the neighbors she'd terrorized and controlled, past the family she'd tried to destroy, Karen Whitmore finally understood the difference between power and respect. But the question that would haunt her through the long, empty nights ahead was whether it was too late to learn how to earn the latter. Behind her, the community began the work of healing, and Marcus Rodriguez quietly deleted the phone number for his old commanding officer, who had been very interested, to hear about HOA abuses affecting military families. Some battles, Karen realized, were lost before they even began.